As mentioned before, my name is Patrick Chameleon. I'm joined here on the stage with Dr. Harasta, Dr. Jesse Harasta, who is the Associate Professor of International Studies and Social Sciences. And also live on our Zoom call, we are joined with Hasmik, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Djoulakian, and also Marsoobian. Is this
correct?
Okay, wonderful. So welcome both, and thank you so much for joining us to Common Ground. Harmon, would you mind speaking about what the topic for today is?
Yes, so the topic for today is the war in Karabakh, or as Armenians like to call it, Arshak. Arshak is the Republic of Arshak, which is within the international borders of Azerbaijan. Maybe your audience hasn't heard very much about this, given the dominance in the media with regard to the election in the United States and also the pandemic. But a war began on September 27th, and that war continued for 43 days. And yesterday, the war, the fighting for now has ceased with an agreement brokered by Russia between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But this war has a long background, and I will try to be brief about this context of the war. Armenians have lived in this region, and the region is the Southern Caucasus. This is the area roughly between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. It's a mountainous area. Armenians also lived in regions to the west of the Caucasus and the southwest of the Caucasus. This was known as the Armenian Plateau or the Armenian Highland. Now, some in your audience might know something about the Armenian Genocide, which was committed in 1915 to 1923 in what was the Ottoman Empire. That genocide took at various stages. The latter stages of that genocide took place in the Caucasus. But as I said, the Armenians lived in this region for thousands of years. There is archaeological evidence going back to 800 BC. There is architectural evidence from the 600s, 700s AD. Armenians were the first Christians, and in this area, there's quite a bit of archaeological evidence of the original Christian churches, medieval churches. The Azeris are a Turkic people who arrived in this region in the late Middle Ages. We're talking at various stages in the 1200s, 1300s. So by the beginning of the 20th century, this region had quite a mix of populations. There were some areas that were more heavily Armenian, other areas that were more heavily Turkic. In the Russian Empire, which ruled this area, the Turkic people were referred to as Tartars. This region of Nagorno-Karabakh had a mixed population, but it was primarily Armenian. And at the collapse of the Russian Empire at the end of the First World War, the peoples in this area created their own independent republics. There was the Republic of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Borders were very fluid. Armenia was independent for a little over 2 years, but with the Bolshevik armies coming into the Caucasus and taking back territories that were part of the Russian Empire, arbitrarily setting up borders and putting populations in different republics. So you hear in the media that this region is predominantly Armenian, but it's set within the Republic of Azerbaijan. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, it was a period of time beginning in 1988 through 1991. These Soviet republics claimed their independence. The region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which had an autonomy within the Azeri Republic, moved for independence with a plebiscite, and a war broke out, which ended in 1994 with the Armenian side gaining most of the territory that was Karabakh and the surrounding regions. And a ceasefire took effect, and for 30 years, that ceasefire was in effect with various violations until September 27th, when the Azeris decided to use their military might to reconquer what they saw as their territories. There's a lot there to absorb, but I hope I've sort of covered some of it. And I don't know if my colleague here, Hasmik, wants to add something to that.
Sure. No, thank you for that overview, that holistic look. There's much more to say about the history than we can possibly fit into this however long conversation we're having here. I think some key points that you've already touched on that I just want to also emphasize is that Artsakh passed a referendum and voted for its independence exactly in the same way as Azerbaijan did after the fall of the Soviet Union. So Artsakh was never incorporated into an independent Azerbaijan. That's an important thing to note. And even just putting aside all of the history and all of the context and everything that points so clearly to Armenians being indigenous to this land for millennia, I think it's very important to make really clear that this has been a war, yes, for 43, and yesterday was the 44th day, but it's also been an unfolding and deepening humanitarian crisis where civilians have been bombed constantly. So this isn't just Azerbaijan waging war against Armenia. This is Azerbaijan in partnership with Turkey in buying thousands and thousands and thousands of drones from Israel. Turkey recruiting mercenaries from Syria. This is a widely reported thing that's been happening. They've been bombing. They up until the deal that was struck yesterday. They've been bombing hospitals. They've been bombing schools, cultural centers. It constantly. The bombings were incessant. So it's important to, I think a lot of the time in a Western context, it's really easy to think, oh, this is an ethnic dispute. I've seen so many article headlines calling this an ethnic tinderbox. Like what that even means, I don't know. But it's important to not see this as just a clash or as just an inevitable ethnic thing that's happening somewhere in the Middle East. This is a very calculated move between the partnership of Turkey and Azerbaijan to grow and expand their empires. And they've been able to do this because of their oil money and because of the partnerships and because of the deals that they've struck with other nations. So oil money speaks, it goes far, and we've seen how far it's gone, and we've seen the destruction that the past month and a half has had, not only on the soldiers that have been fighting, but on the civilians of Artsakh. And Artsakh has been referred to as a conflict zone. It's not a conflict zone. This is where people live. This is people's homes that have been routinely destroyed over the course of 44 days, and the international community has been largely silent. Azerbaijan has broken 3 ceasefires, and now this is where we're at.
Wow. Thank you so much for all of that information. That is really a lot to digest. And I think I can speak just for myself. that I was not made aware of this conflict until Dr. Harasta brought it to my attention. And I guess my question would be to you, Dr. Harasta, why do you think there is not much presence or like coverage on this issue on a global scale, on the national scale, that's to bring us attention? Is it because this is not an American issue? Is it because this is probably not directly related to the election that was just happening? Why do you think it's
I do think that even in the best of cases, the best of moments, Americans tend to be very insular, very inward looking, and our own news tends to take precedence over things overseas. In this year, the nature of our election, and I suspect, I mean, I'm not sitting on the Azeri war councils by any means, but I suspect that there's a calculation in this, that they were well aware of the fact that there would be no response from the United States during this period. And there wasn't. I mean, the Americans were completely focused upon our own election. But even then, you know, I follow news abroad. I follow news sites in Latin America and in Britain. And even there, the coverage was not great. And it tended to be, as Hasmik says, focusing on this as some sort of, there's this idea, this sort of narrative that there's these ethnic conflicts that just kind of magically erupt, that they're kind of compared to like volcanoes, that they're just there and, oh, it's been 30 years, but guess what? It erupted. And I think that really, that's really lazy reporting. It's really lazy journalism. These are complex issues involving not just ethnic identity, but also the goals and desires of political leaders, the economic systems that we're talking about, the alliances that Hasmik has referred to. I think that we have to examine that the governments involved, in particular the government of Azerbaijan, is an authoritarian dictatorship, which I believe is facing difficulties in this sort of COVID period with its own legitimacy. And this is a very convenient way for them to bolster their own internal legitimacy. Like, these are narratives that are important, but they're not simple and they're not easy. So I think that unfortunately, too often our journalists don't do us a service when covering these types of issues well.
I
yes.
second that, and even a paper like the New York Times, which is supposedly covering more foreign and international news than most of our media, both electronic and print, did a terrible job with covering this conflict, and actually in many ways parroted some of the Azeri government narrative of the events going on. And many of us in the genocide studies field, and I'm not talking just about Armenians, but people who work in this area, complained vehemently to the New York Times unsuccessfully. I've written letters and corrected factual errors. You know, the Times claims to be concerned with facts and the truth, but in this case, they fell far short of that in their reporting. They did 2 front page articles since the conflict began. And while one was written from the perspective within Nagorno-Karabakh and Stepanakert, the capital, it was basically focusing on just the bombing, while the other article was appalling, and it basically took the non-objective Azeri side. And this is true with a lot of the media coverage of it. Actually, we have a program. I'm involved with Columbia University, and this evening we had scheduled coverage, a panel, a symposium on media and this conflict. It was really taking up this issue of why the very lopsided reporting. But given what happened this weekend, it's also going to look at the events that took place in the conclusion of this conflict. And I say conclusion; it's not a conclusion because it's going to, this is just the start of a new phase of what happened here. Sorry to jump in.
Thank you so much. No, it's fine. And I think you brought a very important point for us to cover. And I believe, if I read this correctly, from 1915 to about 1923, over between anywhere 800,000 to 1.5 million people were killed during the conflict, if that's correct. And so
yeah, correct.
I want to refer to it as a genocide, not a conflict.
Not a conflict.
Okay. Thank you.
Right? Sorry.
No, you're fine. And this is great. So it's a genocide. And so how do we judge what is a genocide and what is not? So Dr. Harasta, or even Professor Armin or Hasmik, how do we define what is a genocide and what is not?
There's a whole field of genocide studies and genocide prevention studies. I prefer to think of myself as teaching in the area of genocide prevention. And there are a lot of debates about exactly what qualifies as a genocide. And there's a lot of sort of examples that are kind of peripheral that does this count or does this not count? But I think within what we're talking about, the Armenian genocide and the genocide of also other Christian groups within the Ottoman Empire, at the sort of World War I, immediate post-World War I period that you're referring to. I mean, there are clearly genocides. They fit all the various definitions. And by that, I mean that there is if we're going with the most commonly used definition by the United Nations, that there is a planned and coordinated strategy to eliminate a group of people in whole or in part. And then there's action upon that to attempt to achieve it. And so we can see that there was a plan established by the Ottoman government to establish a Muslim Turkish territory in what's now what we would call Anatolia, that region that is sort of Turkey. And then they acted upon that in a methodical way to attempt to achieve it, setting up various conditions for the annihilation of groups that they saw as undesirable.
Any comment to that?
Yeah, I mean, I endorse that description. What has gone historically with regard to the Armenian genocide is the Turkish government's attempt to deny it, and they've attempted to deny it. Denial is central to the concept of genocide, and with the Ottoman Turkish government from the beginning of the genocide denied that they were committing a genocide and calling it other things. So this was a deportation, a relocation for military necessity. And since the First World War, the government of the Republic of Turkey has spent millions and millions of dollars investing in PR companies, corrupting academic institutions to perpetrate this narrative that there was no genocide, that was even a reverse genocide, that the Armenians were the victims of the Turks in this period. And that kind of denial results in a narrative, a national narrative that perpetuates the kinds of hatred that come to the surface in conflicts such as this one in Karabakh. Because if you don't come to terms with your own history, and this is something you should appreciate with regard to the United States, if we don't come to terms with our own history, we won't be able to provide the kind of social justice in our country with regard to systemic racism, with the treatment of Native Americans in the United States, which most scholars now have moved to calling genocides. We committed genocides in our country, even though we don't like to use the term in terms of what we did. And that has perpetuated a continuing culture of violence in our country and in countries like Turkey and Turkey's allies. And that's why this is, if you want to sort of step back and say, well, why is this important to focus on what happens in this sort of out of the way place that no one really has heard of?
Right.
It's really a blow to democracy, because Artsakh was a democratic republic that was created at the end of the Soviet Union. Armenia is a democratic country. It's the most democratic country in that region, surrounded by countries like Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkey that are all in varying degrees authoritarian or totalitarian. And we need to both defend people who are attempting to. There's an important principle in international law, and it's in the Charter of the UN, and that's the principle of self-determination. And what the Armenians were trying to do in this region is to determine their own fate in the world and take that fate into their own hands in creating a democracy. And I think there's been a big blow to democracy in this region as a result of what really happened yesterday. I mean, the democracy in Armenia is now under threat because of this. And certainly there will be no democracy for the Armenians in Artsakh. And it just bolsters the kind of dictatorial klepto-petrol mentality of people like the president of Azerbaijan, Aliyev, and the president of Turkey, Erdogan. So it should matter to us, and that's what I'd like to emphasize. If we really believe in the principles of which we give credence to.
I can add one thing. I think that's very well put. And I think what you're pointing to about pointing out about genocide is not just a singular event in time, but rather a structure that persists over time. I think that's critical. Of course, during the Armenian Genocide of 1915, we saw 1.5+ million Armenians and other Christians in the area, like Greeks and Assyrians, killed. Yes, that was a catastrophic event that occurred, but that structure of genocide certainly has persisted and continues to persist into the present day, like we've seen when Nakhichevan was conquered, when tens of thousands of khachkars and tombstones and hundreds of churches were obliterated to just erase any trace of Armenian history from that land. We've seen the structure of genocide persist, as you've pointed out, with the how fundamental erasure, and this is your line of expertise, Dr. Marsoobian, but how fundamental erasure and forgetting is to Turkish ultranationalist identity. We saw this structure persist with the Sumgait and Baku massacres in the late 20th century. We saw it persist in 2016 when civilians in Artsakh were executed during one of the more recent acts of aggression by Azerbaijan. We see it today. We've been seeing it when villages have been burned down and civilians have been executed and beheaded. And there was actually a $100 incentive given to the hired mercenaries for every Armenian head that was beheaded. That's today. That's happening today. So the structure of genocide and empire building by Turkey and Azerbaijan persists. This is fundamentally about settler colonialism. It's fundamentally about ethnic cleansing. And it's not about, I mean, it's not about the land in any meaningful way. How could it be about the land in any meaningful way when they've destroyed, they've burned down thousands of acres of forests in Artsakh using white phosphorus? How could there be any meaningful attachment to that land if they've destroyed it in that way? It's not about the land. It's about having claim over the land and about Armenians not being there on that land. So Artsakh isn't, we've certainly lost a very painful and significant amount of our ancestral homelands in Artsakh, including Shushi, but Artsakh isn't gone. There, we haven't lost all of Artsakh. So I do also want that to be clear.
Jesse, you wanted to add something?
Actually, I wanted to ask a question of Hasmik. If we could step back to this discussion about Armenia as a democracy in Armenia, because I think it's really important for us to kind of talk about the contrast between these two warring states, right, of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And Hasmik, I know that you were in Armenia in 2018 during the Velvet Revolution, which brought the current kind of more democratic regime to power. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and your experiences.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much to say. I'll be brief. Although it's really hard for me to be brief about that because it was the most meaningful experience of my life. But yeah, it was about a month and a half or so of people all across the country of Armenia and from a distance within the diaspora rising up and taking to the streets and demanding that Serj Sarkisyan, who was the former prime minister of Armenia, be removed from his position and replaced with the democratically elected Nikol Pashinyan, who has made a lot of strides, certainly in trying to repair the decades of corruption that the country of Armenia has been subjected to, and the theft of its resources, and more too much to get into really. But in terms of the Velvet Revolution, it was just an awakening among I would say that Armenians, for me growing up, there's been a lot of somberness around Armenian identity. There's been this feeling of the oligarchs are, tearing our country apart, and we have this history of genocide and just this existential threat that runs really core to Armenian identity and the sense of survival, though, and unity that can come with that. But it wasn't until the Velvet Revolution that it was just such sheer joy of everyone coming together in all these different ways. I didn't go to work for a month. It was just every single day. It was like 15 hours of just being in the streets and protesting, and it was incredible. And it was victorious. It was successful, and there was not a single life lost, and there were no serious injuries even.
Let me add something to that, because of the dangers that are going on today in Armenia since the agreement that was signed by Pashinyan and Putin and Aliyev. There was clearly some of the people who were involved in the old regime in Armenia have had grudges against what Pashinyan has been doing in terms of fighting corruption. And there was a mob that entered the parliament and caused damage and injured people. And many of the parties that have been lost the last election have now sort of united to try to calling for the resignation of Pashinyan. And these are the people who have robbed Armenia for the last 20 years and have prevented the development of a robust economy that can support a robust democracy. And that kind of danger of these forces that we thought were put into check with the Velvet Revolution are still there, and we should be very vigilant as Armenians to support Pashinyan for all. I'm not saying he's made all the best decisions in the last 2 years, but certainly it's been refreshing to see someone who is really committed to democratic principles. And Armenians, was mentioned about why this happened now. I mean, the U.S. has been absent in foreign policy. Aside from Israel, we've been basically AWOL in terms of our involvement in the world. I mean, we have a president who I don't think would even know where the Caucasus are, let alone where Arshak is. So we've Armenians have been without really true friends. We sort of get lip service at times, and Azerbaijan has been very effective in garnering a lot of support from, as Hasmik said, from Turkey, with their petrodollars buying. It was an asymmetrical war. The Azeri Turkish side had so much more manpower besides the Syrian jihadists they brought in. There's also reports of both Pakistani and Afghan fighters that were brought in. Numerically, it's actually amazing that the war went on for 44 days, because the plan of the Azeris was 5, most 6 days, and the plan was genocide. That was it. They were going to retake the whole territory, and in the process, remove the Armenian population. So in one sense, even though it is a defeat, the incredible heroic actions of thousands of young Armenians prevented another genocide from happening, even though huge war crimes have taken place, as Hasmik was pointing out. White phosphorus, beheadings, targeting of the city of Stepanakert. Something like 65% of the city has been leveled through the bombing.
Yeah, just to remind our viewers and our guests, our point of this dialogue and also the common grounds is to have respectful conversations, not to point fingers at anyone or make like remarks that could be considered derogatory towards any individual, but just to listen and for us to understand how can we better be a community, not just within the small towns that we are, but better community for the world that we live in. And I guess my question to Dr. Harasta, as you are currently the international studies professor here on Cazenovia's campus, what is the role of the international community in this conflict, and what can be done?
So I think my answer to that question also ties into an earlier question you asked about why we should care.
Why should we care? Yes.
Right? Why? I mean, I think there's two pieces here which folks have been bringing up, but I think maybe it deserves to be brought out. First is that we have an obligation to protect individuals who are communities who are targeted with genocide, and that's been recognized in international law and also in sort of ethics as a universal obligation that all people have and all nations have to act to prevent genocide from occurring. I saw as this began that the genocide prevention scholars began to get into motion to sound the warnings that this was occurring, and that we can see that the stage was set for a genocide. And I agree with Professor Marsoobian that if it had not been for what I also found to be really surprising kind of resilience in the Armenian military forces, this would have been much worse. This could have been much worse. Not that the outcomes are good by any means. So I think we have an obligation. We also, I believe that we stand at a moment when forces of authoritarianism, forces of autocracy and dictatorship are very much on the march globally. And at the same time, there's resistance to that. There's resistance to the sort of the oligarchies and the dictators and the kleptocrats that we're seeing rising up in so many places. And not just in Artsakh and in Armenia, but also in Minsk, where the people in the capital of Belarus, where people are rising up against their long-term dictator in that country. We can see, I think, a similar struggles in the people of Hong Kong, demanding democratic rights that are guaranteed within their own constitution, which are being trampled upon by the government of the People's Republic of China. That we're seeing these sort of the moment that we live in, I believe, is a moment of struggle between democracy and autocracy in a very overt and open way. And I think all people who are concerned for democratic rights, all people who are concerned about the rise of sort of oil-fueled billionaire dictators, and we can see that in Azerbaijan clearer than most other places in the world. Aliyev dictatorship is clearly oil-fueled and they run this incredibly sophisticated police state, right? Where they're oppressing their own people in terrible, terrible ways. That these things are all interlocked, and the struggle in Armenia is the struggle for all people in democracy. So what can we do? I mean, we can seek for more democratic society here in America that is aware of itself as a sister society to other democratic societies. I think that that's an important, that we are in a particularly populous and powerful nation. And if we come to understand ourselves very explicitly as in that regards, not in a kind of imperialist, demanding, controlling way, there are things that we can do to support both as individuals and as members of organizations and within our government to defend the democratic rights of people and to stand on the side of democracy.
I will just add or ask this question. This is open to anyone. America is about 200 and something years old. We're approaching maybe 300 if we're not.
A little young.
We're a little young in democracy. But we are the example of democracy for the rest of the world. Or we project our example of democracy to the rest of the world. Does that democracy need to be upgraded? Do we need to update to a 2020 version of democracy or 2021? Does it fit the situations of all these other countries that we've been talking about today? Does that democracy, does it reign in these other nations?
Well, let me take a crack at that. I think that our democracy has always been an experiment, and the experiment is still continuing. And it's a democracy that has many flaws. Those flaws were built in when our country gained its independence. Those flaws were built into our U.S. Constitution. Somehow we tend to also buy into a kind of national narrative, or we had been buying into national narrative that tried to diminish or minimize those flaws. And of course, the major sin of our founding was slavery. And those continue to today. And we are always have to be vigilant here with regard to our democracy. And our democracy is not perfect, but we need to support, as was just said, democratic movements around the world, because there has been, and I would say this has been for at least the last decade, a push against democracy. We, at the end of the Cold War, we were celebrating how the Soviet Union, that great threat, had been abolished, and that democracies would arise around the world. And many dictatorships, especially in South America, fell. but there's been regression. And there's been regression here in the United States, and I think there've been certainly definite regression even in Europe and within the EU. We have examples of Poland and Hungary, just as to point out. So there are great dangers, and we don't have a perfect system, and we shouldn't be telling other people what their systems are, but we should support efforts at democratization around the world. I, for 12 years, have worked with people in Turkey to support their civil society and their attempts to strengthen their democracy. Unfortunately, that's been going backwards for the last 4 or 5 years. People I've worked with there are in jail or have fled. So the direction of democracy is never linear and forward. There are always moments of regression. I think we're facing that today. We faced it in the United States, and I don't want to sound too alarmist, but there are aspects of what we've gone through and what other countries have gone through that are bringing up reminiscent of some of the things that were happening in the late 1920s and early 30s in Europe with the rise of fascism and Nazism. So we need to keep the lessons of history in mind. And that's the big picture, even though we're talking about a little piece of land in the Caucasus that no one has ever heard of.
I'll make 2 brief points. 2 points that are kind of parallel, the way I see it. And I suppose in answer to your question, Patrick, of does the US's democracy need work, is a very short, yes, it does. And I think that there's oftentimes a very, to be frank, self-righteous and arrogant strain in Western and specifically US politics that assumes that democracy is a Western phenomenon exclusively, and it's not. It's absolutely not something that the US is the benefactor and the arbiter of around the world. Places around the world have democracies, and they're not Western countries. For example, the Supreme Court of Artsakh is composed of all women. That's something I didn't know until the recent few weeks. Perhaps that's something that viewers and you all were not aware of as well. Yeah. So parallel point. The second one being the U.S. has long used the veneer of democracy as a reason to inflict harm onto different countries over the past few decades, namely, for example, in the U.S. war on terror of the early 20th century. So I think we have to be very careful and intentional when we're talking about how the U.S. positions itself to democracy, or namely to the idea of democracy, and how that impacts the United States role in international politics. I mean, if the U.S. can't sanction its fellow NATO member Turkey that's engaging in ethnic cleansing, what is the U.S. really doing? How is it really supporting democracies and fledgling democracies across the world if it can't take a stand like that, at least?
Jesse, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think Hasmik was very on point with those last comments. I think when I think about the promotion of democracy, I think I also am very hesitant to the idea of the U.S. state, the government promoting democracies abroad, because I think that tends, as she says, to serve as this cover for far more unsavory and nefarious activities. But I do think that us as individuals and us as members of our own organizations can stand in solidarity. And I think that solidarity can go in 2 directions. And we're clearly facing significant problems in this country of democracy, of political polarization. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from folks abroad who have struggled with issues, who have lessons that they can teach us. And then there may be things that we can teach our organizations, maybe not our country as a nation, but us as individuals, learning from others, and also where applicable, where invited, providing our own insights and our own assistance when invited, when asked. The Armenian diaspora and the Armenian nation, for example, specifically asked for assistance. They asked for donations. They asked for solidarity. And I think in those types of cases during this conflict, it's entirely appropriate and right just to step forward and say, yes, you have asked for help, and we can provide that help when we can and how we can. But when we talk about the United States as a government, as a nation, I think it's much more complicated and troubled.
Absolutely. I guess my only question is, how can we continue to help? How can we help more? Is there any websites that the people can visit that you would recommend for us to visit, to donate, to share, to sign a petition? How can we help?
I can share. There's a variety of ways to help. Armeniafund.org. There's a tab where you can donate. Is there a way, Patrick, where maybe I can provide some links also to share?
Absolutely. Our chat is open, so if you are on our YouTube page, the live, you can type it into the chat, and that's open for people to see as well.
I'll do that. Yeah. Armeniafund.org, donate tab, namely, and then also there's a group. There's a variety of places you can donate, but I'm just going to name the two that I know of well.
Okay.
So there's a group called Quirigs. It's KOOYRIGS. If you go on that website, there's also a way to donate. So those folks are hand delivering essentials to the 100,000 plus people that have had to flee Artsakh over the past several weeks. And anca.org /action-alerts, I believe is how it is. You could just go to anca.org. There's a ton of scripts for calling, for signing petitions, although at this point, much good that is anymore, but just FYI that's a resource. And I also like to just say a quick word about solidarity and the pivotal importance of solidarity right now, and every non-Armenian finding their role in being in solidarity right now. Solidarity is not a transaction. It's not something to really be overthought, I suppose. Whatever means a person has of standing in solidarity with folks undergoing something like this, we all need to find what our place is in that. And I would say to my fellow Armenian diasporans to be unabashed in your efforts. At first, in the first couple of weeks, I was completely distraught. I felt like most of my friends, most of my colleagues, most of the people in my networks were completely silent. I was posting on Facebook every day. I felt like I was screaming into a void. And then I started messaging people individually, and I started being a little bit more direct. And I made like a fundraiser on Facebook where I'm raffling off a bunch of items. And to date, I've fundraised $5,000 from my friends and my colleagues in my different networks, which, I understand I do have, I have a college education. I have a level of privilege that I'm trying to be very aware of, but I believe that a lot of people are also in my shoes too. And I would just say, make it really easy for people to donate. Like, send your Venmo link. Like, if for some people, sending some money on Venmo is a lot easier than going to a website and putting your credit card information and whatnot. So make it really easy for people and be very direct and be not confrontational, but no holds barred. This is where we're at. So reach out to all of your networks, be creative. Don't be afraid of making people uncomfortable, because if your friends are not going to stand with you right now, fellow Armenian diasporans, are they even really your friends? Should you even really worry about those relationships?
I second everything that Hasmik has said, and compounding the crisis with 100,000 refugees now in Armenia. We're talking about a small country with less than 1 million population. What is also being compounded is the incredible increase in the COVID-19 in Armenia, the pandemic. Because of the war, people have basically stopped the kind of social distancing and the measures to keep the virus in check, and the hospitals are overwhelmed with war casualties. So there's a real humanitarian crisis there. And it's set Armenia back maybe a decade. So Armenia is going to need a lot of help over the next dozen years to recover from what has happened in these 44 days. Please do reach out and contribute what you can. And also any opportunity people have to speak with their people in government. I do it all the time. It's been very futile because my congressperson and my senators are all focused on the election. They basically, all I get is auto replies. But maybe now that the election is sort of going to be in the past, there'll be more attention paid. And certainly President-elect Biden is much better for Armenia than we've had in the last 4 years with President Trump. Not to get political here, but it's just the fact that Biden is much more aware of international issues and these issues of totalitarian states, because what President Trump liked was the people who are these strongmen, these dictators, and we know that from Erdogan to Aliyev, where Trump has investments in Baku. So Armenia will need help.
Jesse, you wanted to add?
If I could add in a slightly different direction, not that I absolutely agree that the humanitarian crisis continues, and then after that will come the need to rebuild, and all of that costs money and needs assistance. But on a slightly different sort of direction, I also encourage people to educate themselves on the nature of genocide and the ways that genocides are not these discrete events, but processes which predate the beginning of the official genocide and then continue to echo and can reemerge in the future. This is an area that I teach in, and there are many. If you're a university student, you can take wonderful classes. I don't want to call my own class wonderful, but I know that many of my colleagues in the area of genocide prevention education teach really good, powerful, moving classes that can help with that. And for those who are in the general public who are not in college, they study these things and move beyond the study of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is important and vitally important, but it is not the only form that genocide can take. Genocides take many forms, and we need to understand all of them to prevent all of them, to prevent them from reemerging, from appearing, from happening anew. And also just be the ways that we can try to educate ourselves as Americans to be more aware of affairs of the world, to read more of international news. For instance, I receive a daily news brief in my mailbox from the Council on Foreign Relations. And that's a free service. You can go to the CFR.org and you can sign up for their daily news brief. And it's just a summary of each continent of the globe and sort of major events that have happened. And even if you just have 10 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day, you can glance at these summaries and you'll get, frankly, a better summary of global news than you will probably from looking at most US-based news sources, just because it's not focused on the US, right? And as much as we need to focus on our internal affairs, and we do need to make sure that our own house is in order, we have to work against a culture of ignorance about the globe and about things that happen outside of our own circle. That takes a conscious effort by Americans to do, because that's not the society that we live in. That's not what we focus on.
Yes. Well, our name of the show is Common Grounds. I guess, what would be your proposal or proposition in an ideal world that would help us all find common ground for us to understand that we are one species and to live in harmony? What do you think that would take?
Well, I that's a difficult question, but let me take a crack at it. I think getting to know people on a basic level, um, knowing other cultures, understanding our common humanity, and this is related in ways to things that I've been involved in Turkey. You know, I'm probably the oldest one here. I grew up in an Armenian diaspora in New York City. Um, I probably, as a young child, had a certain view of Turks as the people that killed, dozens and dozens of members of my family in the Armenian Genocide. Um, but and for many years, I was reluctant to ever travel to Turkey. But about a dozen years ago, I went, and I've met a lot of Turks outside of Turkey and in Turkey, and I've been working with them. And it's amazing how many things we have in common that we love culturally that are quite the same. And that kind of activity that NGOs engage in countries where they try to develop relationships, people to people relationships. And this is what you're talking about, Patrick, a common ground, finding, their love of the arts, their love of food, their love of other cultural activities, and supporting those kinds of activities. I was involved with organizations that try to do that between Turks and Armenians. And there were early on, no longer, there were efforts to do the same between Azeris and Armenians. But those have, all been co-opted by the people on the top. So we need to work harder on the bottom in a way to at all reach a common ground, a common understanding. And part of it is what Jesse was saying: learn more about other people, learn what's going on in other cultures around the world. Yeah.
I agree. I think that that's crucial. I also think that I'll first say that my initial response to this is quite blunt. Like, hold dictators accountable. How can we have peace, and how can we live in harmony with the continued threat of ethnic cleansing? We have to hold dictators accountable. Period. There is no harmony without that. I think that on more of an individual level, certainly people, Azeris living in Azerbaijan and Turkish people living in Turkey have a responsibility to try to unlearn some of the ultra-nationalist propaganda that they are completely inundated with. That's something that we need to see more of. There's handfuls, small handfuls that I've personally seen of anti-war statements coming out of Azerbaijan, but it's dishearteningly tiny, and we need to see more of that.
Jesse?
I think that our attempts at kind of person-to-person diplomacy are necessary, but not sufficient to deal with the conflicts in the globe. I think that we have to recognize that there are systems, global and local systems, that reward greed and the search for power and domination, and reward and reinforce those. And while those systems operate, and people like the Aliyev dictatorship in Azerbaijan, folks like them are able to profit from massively the oppression against other humans, both their own people and others, then we're going to be continuing to face this. We have to take a systemic approach where we try to figure out what are the systems that reward and perpetuate exploitation, oppression, violence, and hatred, and then work to undermine those systems.
Yeah. we're dealing with some of the same issues within our own systems here, right? So how can we hope to change the system over there? Yes, people don't look to America as, this perfect place, but people come to America for this idea of freedom and the American dream. So America has done a wonderful job of marketing to the world about this American dream, and so we know from experience that this system is flawed and needs to be changed. Um, as citizens, we have the rights to vote, to elect the people who represent us. How can we use that power to really change the system? And I know we're running out of time, so you guys don't have to answer this question. But would you like to leave us with any final thoughts for today?
Well, my final thought is really connected with what Jesse was saying, was that we have to re-engage with the world and world institutions. We've been disengaging for the last 4 years. We need to join international bodies again that will hold these dictators accountable. And it wasn't just under Trump, but this goes back, more than a decade. We need to join the International Criminal Court. Armenia needs to join the International Criminal Court so that dictators can be brought before the court of law. International law is there. We saw this and I've written about this, we saw with the Bosnian War and the Bosnian Genocide, many of the perpetrators, they were brought to The Hague and they were convicted of genocide and war crimes. We saw that with Nuremberg and selection of the Nazi leadership. So even though there's this sort of agreement that was signed yesterday, we should be pursuing these international forums for prosecuting perpetrators of genocide, and that was what was attempted here in Arshak, was the intent to destroy. And so I mean, that was my sort of concluding thought. We need to re-engage in world institutions, and we need to rebuild our partnerships with our democratic allies. I mean, the only country that really spoke up in a strong way, but they were very limited in what they could do, was France. We should put more pressure on many of our European allies in this regard. But if it's, from pulling out of the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreement, all these things need to be reversed so that we could play a much more rigorous role in the international affairs and be a force for democracy.
I certainly agree with that. For me personally, that all is a necessary part of this picture. But I emotionally, I don't know, even politically, the place that I'm in is being really convinced at this point that the unity of Armenians, both in Armenia and in Artsakh and in the diaspora, is the strongest thing that we have available to us. Certainly we need both individual people's solidarity, and we need this type of international action that you're pointing out, Dr. Marsoobian. That's all. I mean, all of the things are connected, but for me, that unity remains really key. And also, as Jesse was pointing out, noticing and being really intentional about noticing and understanding the ways that flows of money and flows of power all around the world are connected to what's happening. And there's too much to name, but just as one other example, the fact that England now has its eyes set on mining in Artsakh, and the connection that BP has to Azerbaijan. I mean, these things are intimately connected. So noticing those links and trying to the extent that we're able creatively and through forming connections and solidarities with other people, figuring out how to both educate ourselves, educate other people, and then what concrete steps and actions can we take from there.
I'm going to take a slightly different direction on mine. My concluding thoughts are to thank the folks who are involved here today. I want to thank you, Patrick, for taking time in this show to talk about an issue that's not really on the forefront of most Americans' minds, but I think is important. I want to thank both Hasmik and Armin for giving us their time and having patience with us on all of this. It's really great that you guys were able to help us here today, to talk about this, to provide your insights and knowledge. And I also want to thank Jay, who's the tech here today, who he did a heroic effort to get everything to work. And he's the unsung hero.
Yeah, and Will.
And Will, who will stop by to give some help as well. So if you're listening, thank you. So, and thanks to everybody as well who's tuned in to hear us. And my students, I didn't realize there wasn't going to be a Q&A, so you can send me your questions.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, we had an open chat. We forgot to mention that there was an open chat available, and you could have submitted your questions there. And I guess I'll just wrap up everything that I've heard today. The one word that sticks out to me is greed. It's people are not satisfied and they want more and more, and they are willing to sacrifice human lives in order to feel some type of content or satisfaction to fuel that greed. So yes, again, Hasmik, Armin, thank you again for joining us today. This was a delightful conversation, very heavy stuff to digest because it is an important issue that we need to cover. It is an important issue that we need to pay attention to because as human beings, we have a responsibility to one another on this planet to help keep each other safe and to listen to one another when we're going through such great ordeals. So thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Harasta, for your time today. And we hope you can join us sometime in person. We would love to have you down. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
For everyone involved in organizing this and everyone who tuned in. If anybody wants further resources or anything, I'm just going to put my email in the chat.
Okay, great.
Great. And I will put my email in the chat also. And feel free to reach out, anyone, for more information, sources, articles, videos.
Yes.
Others. Yep.
So we'll take all this information. We will edit this out to make me look great. And and we will put all of this information in the bios on our YouTube page. So it is Kaz Common Grounds Live, and this will all be posted live on YouTube, and you'll be free to share it with your friends and family as well. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Sorry.
All right. Thank you. And to you, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Harasta, your students, thank you. Have a good evening.
Good evening.